Goshen, high noon. A 40-year-old prince, draped in the fine linen of the Egyptian royal house, steps down into the brutal heat of the mud brick pits. He watches a violent Egyptian taskmaster viciously strike a Hebrew slave, and the prince decides to intervene. He looks this way and that way, sees no one, strikes the Egyptian dead, and buries his lifeless body in the sand. But look closely at the text. See the scene. The prince kills a grown man in broad daylight, yet no sword is drawn, no spear is thrust, and no physical weapon is ever named in the text. Read that again. A murder weapon that does not exist, and a secret, supposedly perfectly buried in the deep sand, reaches the ears of the sprawling Hebrew camps and the high throne room of Pharaoh before the sun rises twice. A dead body flawlessly hidden. A private act of vengeance that instantly becomes a national scandal. Picture it. A man trained in the highest military tactics of the 18th dynasty commits a fatal act of violence, covers his tracks with the meticulous care of an assassin, and yet his cover is blown in a matter of hours. The sand was supposed to be the perfect accomplice. It swallows monuments, it swallows entire cities, but it could not swallow this. We have to go back to the source text to see what the English translation obscures. The book of Exodus, chapter 2, verses 11 and 12 inches, the King James Version reads, "And it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren, and looked on their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian, and hid him in the sand." Stop right there. He slew the Egyptian. The Hebrew word used here for smiting or slaying is nakah. It means to strike, to wound, to fatally conquer. But the canonical text is completely silent on the instrument of death. Every other time a major biblical figure strikes a man dead in a targeted execution, we are told exactly what they used. David used a sling and a smooth stone. Phinehas used a javelin. Ehud used a hidden double-edged dagger. Jael used a tent peg and a heavy hammer. Moses uses nothing. He just strikes him. Sit with that. To understand what actually happened in the dirt of Goshen, we have to look beyond the Western canon. We have to consult the ancient Jewish scribes who carried the oral traditions of this very day. We must open Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, an ancient Aramaic translation and commentary of the Torah that records early Jewish oral traditions surrounding the Exodus. The Targum does not change the canonical text. It expands it. It fills in the heavy gaps that the Hebrew authors assumed their original readers already knew. And according to the ancient Aramaic writers, Moses did not need a blade of iron or bronze to drop the taskmaster into the dust. The Prince of Egypt brought something far more dangerous, far more ancient, into the brickyards that day. The sand could hide the blood, the sand could hide the flesh, but the sand could not bury the method. One dead taskmaster, one missing weapon, and a desert grave that failed to keep its mouth shut. The ancient Aramaic text is about to reveal exactly how the Prince of Egypt executed a man without ever drawing a sword. What did Moses actually use to strike the Egyptian dead? The Egyptian drops. No cry, no prolonged struggle, just a sudden, heavy collapse into the mud of Goshen. The sand absorbs the impact. A royal prince of the most powerful empire on earth stands over a dead taskmaster. The King James Version says, Moses slew him, but look at the mechanics of an assassination in the ancient world. To kill a hardened, whip-wielding slave driver with bare hands requires time, noise, and chaos. It demands a struggle, a desperate, breathless fight in the dirt. But the canonical text records no struggle, just a single, decisive strike. One moment, the Egyptian is swinging the lash. The next, he is dead. Western art pictures a young, impulsive Moses drawing a concealed bronze short sword. The mind invents the flash of a blade in the Egyptian sunlight, but the text refuses to give us a blade. It refuses to give us a club or a stone. The weapon is deliberately withheld. The Hebrew word naka demands a strike, but it does not demand a physical object. Hold that image. A weaponless execution in the middle of a bustling brickyard. Centuries later, a man named Stephen stands before the High Council in Jerusalem, just moments before he is stoned to death. In Acts chapter 7, verses 22 and 24, Stephen gives us a crucial detail about the Prince of Egypt right before this killing. He says, "And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deed. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him, and avenged him that was oppressed, and smote the Egyptian." Stop right there. Mighty in words and in deeds. The Greek word used for words is logos, speech, utterance. The New Testament text points us toward a power that is not just in his hands, but in his mouth. Go back to the sand. Exodus 2:12. "And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian." We have always assumed Moses was checking the perimeter for witnesses, looking over his shoulder to make sure no royal guards were on patrol. But ancient Jewish scholars read this verse and saw something entirely different. What if he wasn't looking for guards? The Midrashic tradition suggests he was looking at the Egyptian himself, searching the man's spiritual lineage through prophetic sight, looking this way and that through time to see if there was any righteous seed, any future redemption that would come from this taskmaster's bloodline. He saw no man. He saw a dead end. Reading, not inventing. And so he strikes. But the sand reveals no physical weapon. The dirt is disturbed only by a falling body, not a chaotic brawl. The canonical text locks the mechanism of death away, leaving us with a quiet, terrifying, instantaneous judgment. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact, but the ancient traditions of Israel refuse to leave this gap empty. They knew what Stephen knew. They knew Moses carried a weapon in his logos, his words. The body is dragged into the dune. The sand is smoothed over. The physical evidence is erased. But the method of the kill is about to break wide open, because a text preserved in Aramaic claims that Moses did not touch the Egyptian at all. It claims the prince spoke exactly one word, and the taskmaster's life was severed from his flesh. One silent death, one buried corpse. But what exact word could a man speak to stop a heart from beating? The scribes of the Targum refused to let the silence of the weapon stand empty. Where the Western mind sees a hidden bronze blade, the ancient Aramaic text sees a weapon composed entirely of breath. The Targum records that Moses stood over the Egyptian, looked upon the man's profound wickedness, and pronounced the Shem Hamaforash, the explicit, ineffable name of God. Picture it. The Prince of Egypt does not draw iron. He draws the hidden theology of his Hebrew mother, Jochebed, preserved in secret behind the palace walls. He breathes the sacred, guarded consonants of the divine name. The vibration of those syllables strikes the taskmaster's soul directly from his flesh. No blood pooling in the mud, no defensive wounds on the victim's body. He spoke. The Egyptian dropped. I hold this as one tradition's record, not the final word. But sit with that. A verbal execution explains the sudden, instantaneous death without a chaotic struggle. It explains the total absence of a physical weapon in the canonical Exodus account, and it perfectly aligns with the martyr Stephen's defense in the book of Acts, calling Moses mighty not just in deeds, but in words. The sand of Goshen opens to receive the dead. Return to the King James text in Exodus 2:12. and hid him in the sand. The Hebrew word for hid here is taman. It means to bury, to conceal, to lay up in a secret vault. The sand was the great eraser of the ancient world. It swallowed monuments, it erased royal decrees, it consumed entire armies. Moses covers the unbruised corpse, smoothing the dry earth until the landscape matches the unbroken terrain around it. Same desert, same deadly silence. The prince believed the sand had sealed the tomb. He believed he had committed the perfect, untraceable act of justice. Hebrews 11:24 and 25 anchors the spiritual weight of this moment. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. He made a violent, permanent choice in the dirt that afternoon. He traded the highest throne of the ancient world for the bloody reality of the brickyards. But a man trained in the royal courts does not throw away an empire on a whim. There were tens of thousands of Hebrews taking the lash across the sprawling construction pits of Goshen. The violence was systemic, daily, crushing, and entirely legal under Egyptian law. Yet Moses stepped out of the palace and singled out this specific taskmaster on this specific day to execute. The sand kept the physical body hidden, but the ancient Jewish historical writings reveal that the taskmaster himself was keeping a much darker secret, one buried in the midnight hours just before this sunup. Moses did not just stumble onto a random, unfortunate beating in the pits. He walked into the agonizing aftermath of a home invasion, one dead Egyptian buried in the dunes, one unnamed Hebrew slave walking away with his life. But what horrific crime was the Egyptian trying to cover up when Moses found him? The hours before sunrise in the sprawling slave quarters of Goshen, the air is heavy with the dust of crushed straw and river mud. A shadow moves between the rows of coarse linen tents. It is not a Hebrew waking early for the labor lines. It is the Egyptian taskmaster, moving with calculated silence toward one specific door. To understand the violent collision in the dirt that afternoon, we have to look at the midnight hours that preceded it. We turn to the Book of Jasher, an ancient Jewish historical text referenced in Joshua and 2 Samuel that expands on the unrecorded years of biblical figures. Jasher pulls back the veil on the hidden crime. It reveals a horror the Western mind often skips past when reading the Exodus account. The taskmaster had fixed his eyes on a Hebrew woman. Her name is recorded in the Midrashic traditions, and she appears later in the canonical text of Leviticus 24-11. Shelomith, the daughter of Dibri, of the tribe of Dan. Picture it. The Egyptian rouses Shelomith's husband in the pitch black, orders him out to the brickyards, hours before the dawn shift begins, and watches him disappear into the dark. Then, the taskmaster turns around. He slips into the pitch-black tent. He approaches Shelomith in the silence, letting her believe the man beside her is her husband. But the husband realizes the deception. He turns back from the labor line, enters his own home, and discovers the brutal violation. The Egyptian knows the husband is now a witness to a crime that breaches even the corrupt laws of Goshen. Under Egyptian rule, the life of a slave is cheap, but an enraged, vengeful husband is a dangerous liability. So the taskmaster drags the Hebrew out into the daylight of the mud pits and begins to systematically beat him to death, to silence him forever. Go back to the canonical text, Exodus 2:11. He spied an Egyptian, smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren. Stop right there. The Hebrew word for smiting is naka. It is the exact same verb used in the very next verse when Moses executes the Egyptian. Same word, same lethal intent. The taskmaster wasn't disciplining a slow worker. He was actively murdering a husband to bury a midnight assault. Read that again. The Prince of Egypt, did not intervene in a labor dispute. He interrupted an execution. I offer it as that one tradition's record of the blood soaked into the ground that morning. But sit with that. The ancient writers tell us Moses saw the injustice with profound clarity. He saw the rape. He saw the attempted murder. He spoke the divine name, and he put the Egyptian into the dunes. The sand swallowed the rapist. The sand concealed the swift justice of the prince. Moses walks away from the burial under the scorching sun. He has traded his royal standing, perhaps his very life, for the sake of one oppressed Hebrew. In his mind, he has forged an unbreakable bond of loyalty with the man he just saved. The secret is sealed in the desert. The earth has closed its mouth. Two men walk away from the sand that afternoon. One believes he has just taken his first step as the hidden deliverer of Israel. The other holds the power to burn down the deliverer's entire world. But what happens the very next morning? When Moses walks back into the brickyards and discovers the true identity of the husband he just saved. Morning breaks over the Nile. Day 2. Moses steps back down into the mud pits of Goshen. The sand of his secret grave sits undisturbed, baking under the early sun. He walks among the slaves, not as a prince checking production quotas, but as a newly minted, silent ally. Then he hears the shouting. He rounds a kiln and finds two Hebrews rolling in the dirt, locked in a vicious fight. Exodus chapter 2, verse 13 inches. The King James records the moment. And when he went out the second day, behold, two men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to him that did the wrong, Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? Stop right there. Look at the word strove. The Hebrew is nitzim. It does not mean a petty argument over bricks or a brief shoving match. It means to struggle violently, to be locked in a desperate, blood-drawing combat. Moses watches two of his own brethren trying to tear each other apart. He steps in, speaking directly to the aggressor. He expects obedience. He expects the quiet reverence of a people who know he has chosen their side. Instead, he is met with a lethal threat. Exodus 2:14. And he said, Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me, as thou killedst the Egyptian? Read that again. The secret is out. The perfect murder is common knowledge in less than 24 hours. But who is speaking these words? The canonical text leaves the brawlers unnamed, but the ancient rabbinic midrash does not. The sages of Israel recorded the identities of these two men, Dathan and Abiram. Sit with that. If you know the wilderness journey, those names carry a heavy shadow. In Numbers chapter 16, Dathan and Abiram will lead a massive rebellion to overthrow Moses, a mutiny so severe the earth itself splits open to swallow them alive. Same men, same bitter defiance. But right here, in the dirt of Goshen, the ancient midrash connects a devastating dot. Dathan is not just a random brawler. Dathan is the husband of Shelomith. Dathan is the very man Moses rescued from the Egyptian taskmaster just hours ago. The man whose life was bought with royal treason. The man who watched Moses speak the lethal judgment over his oppressor is the exact man now weaponizing that secret in the open air. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact, but watch what the text does to Moses in this moment. The betrayal is total. Moses committed murder to protect a Hebrew, and that Hebrew uses the murder to protect his right to beat another Hebrew. The sand failed. It held the dead body, but it could not hold the living tongue. The dirt could hide the Egyptian, but it could not hide the prince from his own people. The words of Dathan ring out across the brickyard. Other slaves stop working. Heads turn. The secret is no longer a whisper in a single tent. It is a shout echoing toward the palace. Moses realizes the Egyptian guards will not have to hunt him down. His own brothers have handed him over. But just how fast does a rumor travel from the mud pits to the highest throne on earth? The brickyard falls dead silent. The ambient noise of thousands of slaves dragging limestone and packing mud seems to evaporate, as Dathan's accusation hangs in the dry, choking air. "Intendest thou to kill me, as thou killedst the Egyptian?" Moses stares at the man he shed blood to protect. The illusion of a grateful, united Hebrew uprising shatters in an instant. Look at the terrifying realization that sweeps over the prince. The King James Version captures the collapse of his entire world in 10 devastating words at the end of Exodus chapter 2, verse 14. "And Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known." Stop right there. Surely this thing is known. The Hebrew word used here for known is yada. It does not mean a vague rumor or a passing suspicion. It means intimate, absolute, undeniable certainty. It is the same word used for a man knowing his wife, or a prophet knowing the voice of the Lord. Moses is not worried that people might be whispering. He realizes they possess the cold, hard fact. The secret has metastasized. He looks down at the dirt. He trusted it. He smoothed the dunes with his own hands, calculating the physics of the desert to swallow a dead weight perfectly. The sand did exactly what it was supposed to do. It absorbed the blood. It held the flesh. The earth kept its mouth shut. It was the people of the promise who tore the grave open. Picture it. The man who will eventually write the Torah, the man who will stand on Sinai and receive the divine law, stands paralyzed in a mud pit, terrified of the very people he came to save. For centuries, we have misread this scene as a simple panic attack over being caught. But the New Testament reveals the deeper, crushing heartbreak in the dirt that morning. Stephen, in Acts 7:25, diagnoses exactly what broke inside Moses, for he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. Read that again. He supposed his brethren would have understood. Moses did not kill the Egyptian in a mindless rage. He struck him down as a deliberate signal. He was announcing himself. He thought the Hebrews would see the dead taskmaster and recognize their deliverer had finally arrived. He thought the revolution was starting. But they did not see a savior. They just saw another Egyptian prince using violence to enforce his will. The sand holds the body, but the wind carries the words. The whisper leaves Dathan's mouth and spreads like a plague through the camps of Goshen. 2 men walked away from the burial yesterday. Now, a massive slave population possesses the leverage to destroy a royal heir. The news leaps from the brickyards to the supply lines. It travels up the hierarchy of the taskmasters, past the regional overseers, and crosses the threshold into the polished stone corridors of the royal palace. Moses knows the architecture of Egyptian power better than anyone. He knows how the intelligence network operates. The moment the slaves know, the guards know. The moment the guards know, the throne knows. A royal prince committing treason to aid the slave population is not a local crime. It is a direct threat to the national security of the empire. The sun is barely high in the sky, and the executioner has become the prey. The machinery of the 18th dynasty is already turning against him. But how does the most powerful ruler on earth respond when he learns his own adopted grandson has spilled Egyptian blood in the dirt? The news hits the polished marble floors of the palace like a thunderclap. The highest seat of earthly power receives the intelligence report from the mud pits of Goshen. A prince of the royal house has not just killed an official, he has aligned himself with the Hebrew slave force. Exodus chapter 2. Verse 15 inches, the King James Version delivers the absolute, fatal shift in power. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. Stop right there. The Hebrew word for sought is bakash. It means to search out, to investigate, to relentlessly demand a life. Pharaoh does not call for a trial. He does not summon his adopted grandson for an interrogation. He demands his head. Picture it. The sand that Moses trusted to hide his crime is now swarming with Egyptian assassins looking for his blood. The prince who woke up in royal linen is now a dead man walking. The law of the empire has turned its massive, crushing weight against him. A royal execution is ordered. The canonical text moves swiftly to his escape, but the ancient scribes record a much closer, far more violent collision. The Book of Jasher and the Rabbinic Midrash claim that Moses did not just hear about the warrant and run. They record that he was actually captured. The ancient texts say Moses was dragged before Pharaoh, condemned for treason, and forced onto the execution block. The executioner raised a sword of pure iron, brought it down on Moses's neck, and the blade miraculously deflected, glancing off as his flesh became like marble. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. But watch what the text does. It paints a picture of a man who survived the wrath of the king only by the direct, intervening hand of God, not by his own military brilliance. He was completely out of control. He breaks free. He runs. But look at how the New Testament redefines this terrified sprint into the desert. Hebrews 11:27 says, "By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured, as seeing him who is invisible." Sit with that. A stunning paradox in the text. Exodus says he feared and fled. Hebrews says he did not fear the king, but forsook Egypt by faith. He wasn't just running away from a sword, he was actively rejecting the throne. He realized the system could not be saved from within. The deliverer could not wear the crown of the oppressor. The same sand he used to bury the Egyptian taskmaster now becomes the only road out of the empire. He leaves the polished stone of the capital and plunges into the deep dunes. No royal chariot, no armed escort, just a solitary fugitive running for his life, stripped of his title, his wealth, his command, and the loyalty of the very people he tried to save. One empire left behind, one vast wasteland waiting to swallow him. But what happens when the man who tried to force God's deliverance with a single violent strike is forced into 40 years of absolute grinding silence? Go back now to the dirt where this film began, the mud brick pits of Goshen, the Egyptian taskmaster falling dead without a blade ever piercing his skin, the prince smoothing the dry earth over the corpse. You have read that scene 100 times as the impulsive mistake of a young, impatient savior. But tonight, that sand looks entirely different. It is not just a failed grave. It is a mirror. Moses thought he was burying an Egyptian. He did not realize God was about to bury him. Look at the absolute halt of his momentum. Exodus chapter 2, verse 15 inches, the King James reads, "But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well." Stop right there. Dwelt in the land of Midian. The Hebrew word for dwelt is yashav. It means to sit down, to remain, to settle into complete stillness. The man who tried to force a national revolution with a single violent strike is now forced to sit quietly by a well in an empty wasteland. He goes from the highest-ranking military commander of the 18th dynasty to a solitary fugitive staring at the water. He tried to use the divine name as an assassin's blade. I hold this as one reading, not the final word. But the ancient scribes understood the absolute danger of wielding the Shem HaMepharash with unsanctified hands. The prince of Egypt thought he was ready to conquer an empire. The God of Israel knew he was not even fit to shepherd a flock. Same desert, same stripping away. The sand of Goshen betrayed his secret in 24 hours. The sand of Midian will hold him in silence for 40 years. Picture it. A man who once spoke a single syllable to stop a human heart now spends his days listening to the wind howl through the granite peaks of Sinai. He has to unlearn the violent speed of the Egyptian military. He has to forget the royal corridors where his commands were absolute. He must be entirely emptied out of his own strength before the Lord will ever trust him with the true staff of deliverance. He leaves the mystery behind in the dirt, but the text leaves a shadow lingering in the dust. Moses sits by the well, staring back toward the west. We know he will return to the palace. We know he will face a new Pharaoh, not with a whispered execution, but with a roaring sea. But what about the Hebrew who betrayed him? What about Dathan? The canonical text promises they will meet again, in the wilderness of Paran, and the earth will open its mouth a second time to swallow a rebellion. We have solved the silence of the missing blade, and we know the identity of the traitor in the mud pits. But the desert is still holding the rest. Comment the word watched and subscribe if you want to keep tracking these ancient threads. Then send this video to one person who loves the Exodus story but has never heard the Aramaic whisper of the weaponless strike. The sand never truly hides what we bury. It only holds it until the appointed time.